Herzlich begrüßen zu unserem Forschungskolloquium. Heute ein besonderer Anlass. Sie wissen ja, dass das mit Dr. Böhling vom Institut für katholische Theologie und genial organisiert von Frau Anna Krone statthabende Forschungskolloquium immer wieder auch mit Gästen von auswärts stattfindet. Ich darf Ihnen kurz sagen, ich freue mich, dass Sie so zahlreich erschienen sind. Wir freuen uns, besonders Frau Deborah Puccia und ich, dass es gelungen ist, Frau Carine Sophie Germond von der Universität in Trondheim einzuladen. Der Vortrag wird auf Englisch stattfinden. Frau Puccia wird auch den besonderen Kollegen Germond vorstellen und einführen. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass es gelungen ist, sie zu gewinnen. Wir haben eine Erasmus-Partnerschaft mit der Universität Trondheim, die wahrgenommen wird bereits von 2 Studierenden. Darüber freuen wir uns besonders. Und wir haben auch vor, diese Partnerschaft noch in vielerlei Hinsicht zu intensivieren. Das vorab von meiner Seite, Frau Puccia, wenn Sie so lieb sind, die Kollegin vorzustellen. Wir gehen jetzt über dann in die andere Sprache, die Lingua Franca Europäer.
English. Yes, this presentation will be in English, and I would like to welcome you, those of you that have joined us here, but also those of you that are with us online. And first and foremost, our colleague, Professor Carine Germond, thank you for having accepted our invitation. So, just a few words how it came to the idea of this invitation. We should have met last year in Florence at the conference. It was not the case, but then we had a very interesting correspondence, of course letters, emails, of course, but we came to the idea to, let's say, revitalize this partnership. Because our university, the University of Hildesheim and the University in Trondheim have had for many years an Erasmus partnership. But it was throughout the years forgotten, and we came to the idea to revitalize it. So this Erasmus partnership means not only students exchanges, but also teacher exchanges. And that's exactly the case today. The colleague has kindly accepted our invitation. She has spoken within one of our seminar this morning, and she will speak this evening about Norway and the European Union. So I say just a few words about you, so that they know you. As I said, she has been teaching at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology since 2016, correct? Correct. She got her PhD in contemporary history from the University of Strasbourg. And she also a Master of Arts and a Bachelor of Arts in German Studies from the University of François Rabelais in Tours. About her career, she was part-time professor from 2018 to 2019 and then visiting professor at the European University Institute in Florence. Before joining the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, she worked as assistant professor in contemporary European and international history at the Maastricht University in the Netherlands. She was also the first recipient of the Clifford Hackett Lectureship in the History of European Integration at Yale University. And I must say, I did not know it. I have discovered through your biography.
You're always still a bit mysterious.
Exactly. She has received the different fellowships from a variety of institutions across Europe. Just a few examples. She was a research fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, a senior manicure fellow at the University of Portsmouth, a Jean Monnet postdoctoral fellow at the European University of Florence, and a research fellow at the German Historical Institute in Paris. She also held a 3-year doctoral fellowship from the Deutsche Forschungskolloquium at the University of Duisburg-Essen. My compliments.
Yeah, I've been all over the place pretty much. That's the short story.
Exactly. Quite the European generation.
Yes, exactly.
And then about their research interest. Carine Germond research covers the diplomatic and political history of the 20th century with a focus on the role of individual leaders in Franco-German cooperation during the Cold War period and from the 1990s onwards. Transnational history with an emphasis on the role of expert and transnational societal actors in policy-making processes within the European Common Agricultural Policy and in European Parliament. Her current research projects are chiefly driven by her interest in the role of leading political figures and experts in political processes, the role of state, but also non-state actors in transnational policy making, the emergence of growing significance of transnational integration factors among and across states, and the transnational political and societal forces that have contributed to the evolution of international organization in general, including the European Union in particular. And as I said, it will be about the European Union and Norway. I want to read the title as I fear it will sound very much Danish and very little Norwegian, but I think it means that Norway did not want to join the European Union.
Still doesn't, but yeah, that's the gist.
So, thank you again for being with us, and I leave you the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, it's always a pleasure for me to return to Germany, even though I will be speaking in English, because I have to say I've become so used to teaching and presenting in English that I could do it in German, but it would just take me a lot more time to prepare. So I went for the more efficient, both in terms of the time and work efficiency, and then if you can bear with me. But I'm happy to take obviously questions auf Deutsch. Das ist natürlich kein Thema. So today I see today a little bit as everything you wanted to know and learn about Norway without even daring to ask. This morning I presented a little bit more broad brush overview of Norwegian post-war history with some insights into the Norwegian political system, so with an emphasis on the democracy and welfare in Norway. But what I'd like to do now is delve a little bit deeper into more details into the ambiguous or ambivalent relationship of Norway to the European Union. And I've titled this talk I Norge liker vi ikke unioner, which basically translates in Norway we don't like unions, and that's some sort of a red thread through this presentation, because obviously in the European Union you have the word union, and obviously as historical reasons, which I will address in a very short time, this also helps explain Norway's, again, somewhat reluctant or ambivalent relationship to the EU in times, but also very much at the present. So we'll start with a little bit of quiz for the technology savvy among you. So if you could just scan the QR code, or unless just type in the URL and enter the code, and then once you're done, then I'll move on to the site. Sorry, I've discovered Mentimeter a few years ago, and I've become a very huge fan because I think the students always enjoy it. So when you're ready, then I'll switch to the little quiz. It's just, you know, for the students among you, there's no grade. It's just to kind of see a little bit how much you know about Norway-EU relationship. So have you all scanned, or at least those of you who want to partake in the quiz? What is the quiz? Yes. Okay, so the first question is, Norway is an EU member state. So doesn't it show up on me?
If you would just look at it, yeah.
No, it doesn't. Okay, well that's a bit of a bummer.
Is the HDMI cable still connected?
Yeah, it's still connected. Well, I mean, I'll just give you, I don't know why this is not showing, it should be. But anyway, so 92% of those who have responded have said no, which was the correct answer. Now, the EEA is an agreement between the EU and Canada, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. the United Kingdom. I think there's you know your Norway-EU relations clearly. Yes, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein was the correct answer. There's also different agreements with Canada, it's the CETA, and with the United Kingdom, well, there is not really an agreement, unfortunately. So we can move on. How many times did Norway apply for membership? 6 times, 4 times, 2 times, 0? Yeah. I see, I can still have you learn something today. So Norway did apply 4 times to the EU, and I will get back to that in a few minutes. And then last but not least, how many times did Norwegian rejected membership? 4 times, 2 times, none. There were 2 referenda, each of which resulted in a no. And again, I will get back to that in a minute. Sorry about the not showing. It did work very well this morning, but clearly sometimes you have these sort of technical issues. Now let's hope that's the, yes, well, at least the PowerPoint. So what I'd like to discuss today, and I will do that in 4 different steps. So first I'd like to explain, yeah, I think it's a bit, can you still read it? Maybe it's a good idea to drop the shades a bit. So I'd like first to say, well, explain a little bit the title of the presentation, which is that Norway doesn't like unions, and it's very much because of its history, and that's why the first part it's called It's the History Stupid. Obviously you might remember this quote from the Clinton era, it's the economy stupid, well here it's the history. Then I'll say a few words about Norway and the EU, from rejection to association. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that there were 2 referendum. Then look a little bit closer at this referendum, which is no to EU membership. The Norwegian goes to EU membership, and again, the first referendum was in 1972, the second one in 1994. And then finish the talk with a discussion of the European Economic Agreement, which is this agreement that organizes the whole relationship between the EU and Norway, and basically ensures that Norway is closely associated with the EU without being an actual member of the EU, which is also why I usually present that as 1 foot in and 1 foot out. So basically having some advantages of association without being a complete members, but obviously that also comes with some problems, or at least controversies, one of which relate to democracy and democratic legitimacy and implications for Norway. But let's start with a little bit of history, and basically kind of contextualizes the relationship of Norway towards unions and the European Union in particular. I'll start with a date, which is the 17th of May, which is a very important day in Norway. It's the national constitution day, a major, it's a bank holiday, which is always nice, especially like this year when it was on a Friday, so we could have a very long weekend. But beyond that, and you see some of the picture here, that's the royal family, because obviously Norway is a constitutional monarchy, so there is a monarch which has some power, but very limited. The actual king is here, Harald V, and then you have the crown prince, his wife, and the heirs to the throne. It's called Constitution Day because what we are celebrating on the 17th of May is the birth of the Norwegian Constitution, so Grundlovsdag in Norwegian, and basically that's a very important day in the national psyche because it marks the end of the union with Denmark and the birth of Norway as an independent state, although independence really became an actual reality in 1905. So you have all these parade, and I think the one thing that always struck me is the amount of Norwegian flags, which I'm not particularly flag patriotic. I mean, even in France, on the 14th of July, it's very rare that you will have people, you know, kind of waving French flags. And for me, it's always kind of striking the amount of flags, which also tells you a little bit of the, you know, how important this is for to show, you know, this is now an Constitution Day, independence, Norway as a state, obviously a really recently established state in comparison with other countries, and I think these flags, which also, by the way, you see people have, you know, hanging on their balcony. So that's I think very specific. For me, as a French, was very striking when I moved here. So a large reason why Norway doesn't like unions is because it has been under foreign dominion for a very long time, and there are three major unions up until the beginning of the 20th century. One was the Kalmar Union, the union with Denmark, and the union with Sweden. I will go very quickly through each of these unions. Let's start with the first one, which goes back to the late 14th century, which was the Kalmar Union and the union with Denmark, which lasted for nearly 4 or 5 centuries. So what that basically means, that from 1397 you had a personal union between Norway, Denmark and Sweden, which also at the time included some parts of Finland. And personal union meant that you had a single crown. So the first monarch to bear the crown was Margaret I, Queen of Denmark, Norway and Sweden. And when she died, it was her son, Eric of Pomerania, who was proclaimed hereditary king of Norway and also elected king of Denmark and Sweden. So again, you have these personal unions among these Scandinavian countries, but that also meant that, you know, you had some form of government in Norway, but basically it was under Danish dominion. And you see still the legacy of these Danish union with Denmark also in the language, because I think I mentioned it earlier this morning. One form of Norwegian is bokmål, which is a Norwegianized version of Danish, which is also, by the way, the Norwegian that I learned. The Kalmar Union was dissolved in 1524, but Norway still remained in, personally I think the shades are the will of their own. But Norway remained in a personal union with Denmark pretty much up until 1814, which obviously, while you had all these independence nationalist movements in the rest of continental Europe, well, Norway was still stuck under Danish dominion. The Kroon, what does that mean? The Kroons were united, so you had one single monarch, but each, and that's a little bit of a difference, Norway also was able to have its own laws, currency and also military. But still you had this personal union between Norway and Denmark. That ended up in 1840 when you had the signing of the Norwegian Constitution at Eidsvoll. Here you have a picture. that shows the signing, and obviously this is the signing of this constitution that we're celebrating on the 17th of May. At the same time, Norwegian nationalistic aspiration was somewhat curtailed because they lost a brief war against Sweden. And that means that from 1814 up until 1905, you had another personal union, this time not with Denmark, but with Sweden. And again, that meant that Sweden and Norway had the same monarch, obviously not a Norwegian, but a Swedish king. That's, for instance, what you, that was this, the time, it's a picture from the time of the union with Sweden. And that was the Swedish king there. So they shared the monarch and conducted a common foreign policy. In 1905, the two governments entered into negotiation, and that eventually led to the full independence of Norwegian, which was also recognized by Sweden, and Norway became an independent constitutional monarchy. So what do these very short historical overview tells us? Well, by European standard, Norway is a relatively young sovereign country, and I think that also explains why you have, this flag patriotism, as I call it. That also means that there is a strong national identity, and you also see that in the sort of revival of, not just through the waving of the flag, but also the revival of all these folklores. For instance, some of these older folkloric costumes, which are called bunad and which are very popular now. I mean, most of them are worn on the 17th of May, but you will also see many Norwegians wearing them for specific occasions like communions, weddings, anniversaries, etc. And I think this is really, each region has its own specific costumes. The colors differ. In Trøndelag, where Trondheim is located, it's mostly blue and black. You have lots of silver jewelry, which costs a little fortune, but still looks somewhat nice. You also see it in the language. Dialects are very strongly prominent in Norway. They're also used on a daily basis, even on a professional setting, which sometimes makes it a little bit harder for me to kind of follow, because some of the dialects are very different from Bokmål. You also see this sort of national identity in a different form of Norwegian, because in Norway you have two official languages and then the dialect. The first official language is Bokmål, which is, again, as I mentioned, a Norwegian version of Danish. And then you have Nynorsk. Nynorsk is basically, literally, the new Norwegian. And as I explained earlier this morning, it's imagine someone, I forgot the name of the guy, but it's like a Brothers Grimm. Instead of collecting Märchen, they decided to collect dialect, and from all these different Norwegian dialects to build up a language. Which is why it's called New Norwegian, because this is slightly an artificial construction, if you like, but it's based on the dialect which were considered Ur-Norwegian, so to speak. So all these different, the flags, the language, the costume, really tells you something about how strong the national identity is for Norwegian. Obviously, the experience of being in personal unions with Denmark and Sweden has made Norwegian also somewhat skeptical towards any kind of union. And obviously, unfortunately, the European Union has the word union in its name, not just because they don't want to be in a union, but also because that they are somewhat skeptical or fear a risk of constraining newly regained national independence and sovereignty. And probably a more recent development is also a wish to preserve the Norwegian Nordic social democratic and welfare model. That's more of a post-war development, but that also plays a role, and I will get back to that in a minute. If you have any questions, I'm happy to pause and answer them, because sometimes I get carried away, so just don't hesitate. I'm happy to take a break and answer questions. So that was just for the very contextualizing why Norway and Norwegians don't like unions, and now we will go into the depths of the subject, which is basically Norway leaving poor Europa at the altar, as the cartoon shows. So it all begins one day, and here in our story it begins basically with the beginning of regional economic integration in Europe, which obviously you have the creation of the
treaties.
Sorry, the Rome Treaties, yes, in 1957, which established the European Economic Community. And when the EEC is created, Norway very quickly refuses to join the European Economic Community. Instead, they opt for a more for strengthening Nordic cooperation with Sweden and Denmark, and that's when in 1952, Iceland and Denmark, and then Sweden, not Denmark, when they create the Nordic Council. This is again strengthened in 1958 with a joint statement for establishing Nordic economic cooperation, which included, for instance, the abolition of custom duties and any kinds of quantitative restrictions, and also the establishment of a Nordic common custom tariff between Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark. So the fourth Scandinavian country which strengthened economic cooperation in particular. So all fine, we have this strong Nordic cooperation, which works quite well, but obviously they also see that the EEC is working very well and succeeding in creating this common market. So that led eventually in 1960 to the creation of the European Free Trade Association by a number of countries who had also decided not to join the European communities, namely Austria, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. And the rationale behind the creation of EFTA was to some extent to establish a bit of a rival organization to the European communities, and especially the main goal was to promote closer economic cooperation and free trade in Europe. There are some similarities, but there are also fundamental differences between the EEC and EFTA. The main difference for EFTA is that the free trade area that EFTA establishes only concerns industrial goods. So that means that agricultural and fisheries products are established. And that's an important exclusion, because agriculture and fishery, and I will get back to talking about these two quite regularly in the subsequent slides, they've been stumbling block for EU membership, for Norway's EU membership applications, and during the negotiation there have been highly contentious questions. Also characteristic of EFTA is that EFTA, at least up until the UK becomes a community member, heavily dominates EFTA, and it's quite interesting. After Brexit, when there was all this discussion of what kind of association should the United Kingdom have with the EU, the Norway EEA model was one of the more softer versions of Brexit, but actually the Norwegians were not particularly keen on having the UK come back into EFTA, because they knew, well, we will end up with a situation which is not unlike it was in the 1960s, where basically because of the UK would also end up dominating. So the Norwegians were actually happy that when the UK decided not to join EFTA after Brexit. We move back to the 1960s, So EFTA is there, but obviously never was strong enough to completely rival or compete with the EC. But in 1962 we have the signature of a Treaty of Cooperation between Norway, Finland, Denmark and Sweden, so again the fourth Scandinavian country, with the aim of developing Nordic cooperation in legislative, cultural, social and economic matters without, again, prejudicing the work carried out by the Nordic countries. So what we see here is basically a two-track policy. One is the strengthening of Nordic cooperation. The second one is EFTA. So obviously it worked very well for a time, but things change when the UK basically decides to apply for membership. And I move to the third part of the presentation, where it's about the no's to the Norwegian no's to EU membership in 72 and 1994. Norway actually applied 4 times to the EU between 1960 and 92. The first time was in 1962, which is about the time when the UK first applies to EC membership. And obviously, because the UK was such a prominent economic partner, it brings into its wake a number of other EFTA countries, together with Ireland, also for obvious reasons. So in 1962, the Norwegian government officially applies for membership in the European Community, and the application letter written by Olvard Lange, which was one of Norway's long-standing foreign minister, basically states Norway's accession will raise special problems owing to its geographical situation and economic structure. As you know, in January 1963, the French President Charles de Gaulle says no, because he didn't want the UK to become a sort of Trojan horse of American interest into the European community. So that kind of puts Norwegian application on ice as well, same as with the UK's application. In 1967, the UK government makes a second bid, and then also Norway, in its way, applies a second time. The application letter is worded in very similar terms. The letter of 13 April 1962, that's the first application, already indicated that Norway's accession to the European Economic Community would raise special problems owing to its geographical situation and economic structure. The Norwegian government, nevertheless, trusts that with understanding on both sides it will be possible to find satisfactory solution to these problems in the course of negotiation. So here it's again the same allusion to Norway's geographical situation and also economic nature, which was at the time very different from that of many continental European countries. Again, Charles de Gaulle says no, so again, the second application kind of ends up into nothing. In 1970, the UK makes a third bid and Norway follows suit. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find the text of the application letter for neither 70 and 1992. This time, the UK gets in, but Norway doesn't, and I will explain why and how in a minute. We have a referendum in 1972, the no wins. I will get back to that in a minute. That means we have a fourth application in 1992. You might say it's application by stealth. Sometimes it works, but here again it doesn't, because in 1992 we have a second referendum which results into a second no. So hence the 2 vetoes and the 2 no's. The main reasons behind the 2 no's in 72 and 1994, they're a mixture of economic and political motives. What we do see is that the first three are in the wake of the UK application, and the main motive was basically the UK is such an important trading partner. If it becomes a member of the EEC, then obviously Norway has to follow. The last one in the early 1990s was basically in the wake of the so-called FTM enlargement, because this was at the time when the Maastricht Treaty was negotiated, and obviously with the tumbling of the Berlin Wall, it was much easier for many of the FTM countries, many of which had a strong policy of neutrality. Then they could join a bloc like the EU here, and that also was the main reasons behind Norway's force application. Some of the recurring issues or challenges of membership application to the EC-EU. Again, we see a mixture both in the 1970s and in the 1990s of political but also economic issues. And these are some of the recurring issues. A major issue was regional policy, which was very important in Norway, because as I was saying earlier this morning, it's large, especially everything that is in the second half of the north of Norway is heavily subsidized by the Norwegian government, otherwise no one would work there. So you get a substantial tax relief, which obviously in this sort of regional policy would become much harder if Norway would become a member. On the other hand, it could also enjoy some funding from the community structural funds. Agriculture has been an important stumbling block, largely because of the nature of Norwegian agriculture and the heavy subsidization of agriculture in Norway. And what we here see is often a problem about the agricultural prices, which have been driven much higher under the cap. Also, the question of the modernization of the Norwegian foodstuff industry was very problematic. Similarly to agriculture, fishery was a very controversial issue, and again another of these major stumbling block for Norway's membership to the EU, because fishery is a very important economic sector in Norway. It's one of the major, beyond energy export, it's one of the major exporting industry of Norway. And here, obviously, under the common fishery policy, Norway would have there was the question of the access to the halieutic resources, which obviously Norway would have had to share to some extent with other community members. Also the question of the import quotas for Norwegian fish and fishery products into the community / the EU, and also the access to the common market for fish and the Norwegian fishing fleet, which then again would have to be regulated under the common fishery policy. Energy policy was also a controversial issue, obviously in the 1970s, that when the first oil fields were in the Norwegian Sea were discovered, and obviously this oil resources created a lot of revenue for the Norwegian state, and then obviously the Norwegian didn't want to lose negotiating and bargaining power over the concession for oil and gas exploration and production, which they probably would have had to do upon becoming a member of the community. There were a number of other issues, perhaps a bit more minor, but which still played a role in the negotiations for EU membership. One was the environment, working condition, consumer protection, public health, and also a number of various other social matters, such as gender equality, because Norway, especially since the 1970s, had a much stronger gender equality policy than the EU had at the time. Again, now probably that wouldn't be such a major issue because the EU has also done a lot in this area, but at the time it was still most of the other European countries were much behind in terms of gender equality and also the labour market. So let us look a little bit deeper at the two referenda and look a little bit at the political divisions and the arguments that were used both for and against. There were a number of political fault lines which are to some extent not completely dissimilar between, although you have a 20-year span between the first referendum and the second one. Let's look at the yes camp first. So among the political parties which campaigned for community membership, we see quite prominently the center-right party Høyre, which literally translates into right. And Høyre was basically the only pure yes party, still is one of the parties which is more supportive of membership. But we also see a majority of representatives from the center-left Labour Party. At the time you had Trygve Bratteli, who was the Statsminister, the Prime Minister, if you like, who also argued and campaigned in favor of the yes. After the referendum, he resigned as well. And you also see factions in the center parties, Venstre, which translates into left, and the Christian Democratic Party. The key arguments they use in favor of Norwegian membership included, for instance, empowering Europe through collaboration. They emphasize the importance of unifying Europe. They also argued that a unified Western Europe would be stronger to stand against the Eastern Bloc. Obviously, we're in the 1970s. Europe is still very much divided. And that's a more economic argument, that membership would strengthen the Norwegian economy. Now let's look at the no camp. Most of the parties that campaign against membership were the Agrarian Centre Party, which was really no party. If you had to pick a yes party, that would be Euro. If you had to pick a no party, that would be the Centre Party, the Centre Party. But you also had faction within the Centre Parties, Venstre, and also the Christian Democratic Party that were against membership. There was also a strong opposition from business interests, especially within the agricultural and fishing industry, and those were among the most outspoken against EU membership. The key arguments they used to campaign against membership, well, they argued that membership would weaken national autonomy and independence, that also the European community was another political alliance that would weaken that would potentially weaken NATO. Obviously, Norway was a founding member of NATO. It's also one of the few European countries that actually share a border with Russia, so obviously the importance of NATO membership. And here that's where you see the problem of the fishing industry, that membership would weaken self-governance of its fishing territories. And again, this is not just a self-understanding of Norwegian as a seafaring power, but also a very important part of Norwegian economy and exports. Membership would also create a greater divide between elected official and the public. Also, you had this really strong proximity between them, and they claimed, at least the no party claimed, that this would weaken that. Membership would also result in non-sustainable use of natural resources, and last but not least, membership would weaken the Norwegian agricultural industry. So here you also see the prominence of agriculture and fishery policy among the reasons behind the no vote. On 25th September 1972, a referendum took place. It was non-binding, but nevertheless had far-reaching implications because a relatively narrow majority, but nevertheless a majority of Norwegians voted against membership of the European community. Most of the yes vote, which are here in green, as you can see, they occurred. Oslo is here, that's the Oslo fjord, and the Oslo area. Some of the pink one are, and the northernest you go, the more widespread is the no vote. Which again shows a sort of north-south divide, and also the center, which would be more Oslo and the Oslo area, and the periphery, which is pretty much the rest of Norway. What the defeat meant was, it was a huge disappointment for the then Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party, Trygve Bratteli, which you can see here. It's a photo from the TV show that kind of monitored the results of the referendum as they come. And as a result of, he had been a vocal advocate of membership, and then basically because the no vote won, ended up resigning his position after the results. So about 20 years later, we had a second referendum, which show very similar political fault lines, and also in terms of the sort of arguments that was used for or against membership. Against, in terms of the support or political advocates for membership, we find the center-right party Øyre, again the only pure yes party, with some in the Labour Party, and the right Liberal Progress Party being largely in favour. What is an important difference is the majority of the Norwegian Business Association this time were in favour of membership. The key argument in support of membership that they use would be that to strengthen the Norwegian economy. Obviously here the European Union of the mid-1990s is very much different from the early 1970s. You have now European Union since Maastricht. You also have a much broader widening of the competence and the policy areas covered by European integration, and obviously a much enlarging European Union, which would also include many of the other Scandinavian countries. Also, Norway should take part in the Union's peacekeeping mission. Obviously, Norway is also the birthplace of the Peace Nobel Prize, and obviously that also belongs to the sort of Norwegian self-understanding that they should make a contribution to world peace. And I know that sounds a little bit like, you know, the Miss Universe, whether you want to contribute, I want to contribute to world peace, but this is not, this is certainly a little bit of the Norwegian psyche as well. Obviously there was also the argument that Norway is a European country geographically, culturally and historically, and that therefore it should participate in the unions that would contribute to strengthen European interests. There was also the consideration that Norway is actually already impacted by EU policy, and that membership would ensure that Norway could participate in the decision making. And this rule maker versus rule taker would be an important part of the discussion on the EA, and I will get back to that in a minute. Also, Norway as a small nation would benefit from membership, and it would strengthen its position when bargaining against larger nations. And last but not least, membership will ensure Norway's participation in the union's work towards evening out the economic differences across the European continent. The no camp, now again we find very similar political fault lines as back in the 1970s. Again, we see this agrarian center party leading the campaign against Norwegian membership, again along with the smaller socialist left parties and the far left party red electoral alliances. We also see Norwegian farmers and fishing associations still being very much opposed to membership, largely because of the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policy. And we also see Norway's largest labor union who decides to support the new vote. Some of the key arguments, again, they are very similar in many ways to what the arguments used in the 1972 referendum campaigns. They were claiming that membership would weaken national autonomy and independence, that it would result in more bureaucracy, that it would increase economic interest and also weaken Norwegian cultural distinctiveness. So here you see the sort of nationalist or nationalistic sort of argument, which we do here if we listen to many populist party, that would certainly ring a bell. Membership would strengthen economic interest, that would also weaken labor rights and result in the non-sustainable use of natural resources. So again, the preservation of the Norwegian social democratic and welfare system came forward quite importantly. That the EU, another argument against is the EU would largely favors larger rich countries and fails to even out economic differences between member states. And Norway should not join the unions that has an out of area clause that enables it to make military actions outside its member states. But obviously at the time that was not yet adopted by NATO, but would be later. And there was also these democratic arguments that the EU was a less democratic organization than the individual member states. So here the infamous democratic deficit of the EU. But what we see is a relative continuity between the two, the arguments that were used. So here, on the 20th of November 1994, the referendum took place, and at the end of the day, a slightly narrower majority of Norwegians voted against membership. So in 1972 that was 53.3, here 52%, so a 1 point difference in a 20-year span. Again, we see most of the yes vote here in the shades of blue, also in southern Norway, the Oslo, strongest in the Oslo area, and surrounding counties. It was a high voter turnout, about 89% of Norwegians turned to vote in the referendum, so it's a very high democratic legitimacy as well. Again, the referendum was only advisory and not politically binding, but the Norwegian parliament decided to keep Norway out of the union. And Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was a very important and leading political personality in Norway, also resigned from a prime minister position at the time, because she's also from the Labour Party and had been a strong advocate of membership. And since the new vote launched, she did the same thing as her predecessor, Bratteli, and resigned. So, as I alluded already, we see strong continuities in terms of the sort of political party divisions on Europe, where we see that the no vote is dominated by political groups from the center-left. We also see differences in the types and the nature of the arguments that have been used for but also against membership. Also very strong similarities in terms of the concerns that were expressed in 1972 and 1994, for instance, the lack of democracy of the EU, the lack of economic justice, the lack of freedom and independence, and also the lack of concern for the environment as well, which is sometimes quite ironic because the Norwegian fly a lot, but they have a high concern for the environment, but that's part of the ambiguities vis-à-vis environmental protection. We also see strong continuity in terms of the spatial distribution of the yes and the no vote. Again, the yes vote tends to be much more prominent in larger cities such as Oslo, which are more internationalized or cosmopolitan by nature, but also tends to have a higher level of education, or where you would locate the elite, whereas the no vote tends to be in the more peripheral and the more agricultural area of Norway. So here we also see, when comparing the outcome of the two referendums, this very strong divide between the center, which would be the Oslo region, and the periphery, a large part of the rest of Norway, and also this very strong north and south divide. The more south you go, the more supportive of membership people are likely to be, and the further north you go, the more opposed they are likely to be. We also see strong continuities in terms of voters' demographic. Here again, there is a strong continuity in terms of farmers, fishermen, and workers being consistently opposed to membership, and also relatively strong continuity in terms of the percentage of votes against, with only 1 point difference. Sorry, that was for 53.5, not 3%, but still relatively strong continuity. Then there is the question, has this changed? Because obviously the last referendum was 30 years ago. How does it look like now? What we see is that the yes camp is slowly increasing, but we're still quite far from, if a referendum should be organized, we're still very far from Norwegian, the overwhelming majority of Norwegian voting yes towards EU membership. I found a number of, at least one poll that was conducted in April 2023 for two newspaper Klassekampen that far left newspaper Nation, I'm not quite sure. But what's the results of the poll, which are more interesting, were that we had 34.1% of Norwegians that were in favor of becoming members of the EU, 40.8%, so we see a slow decrease of the no, but it's still a majority against, and then the 16% that didn't know. The EEA agreement, I will come back to that in the next slide, still has a high support among most people, but more and more people are positive about membership of the EU. We still see a very broad cross-party support for the EEA agreement, where 72 to 90% of the Arbeiter Party, that's a Labour government, the Conservative, Venstre, and other parties saying yes to the EEA agreement. So the EEA agreement is the compromise that still brings the most of support, while EU membership is still relatively controversial. The EEA agreement is also quite popular on the left. SV voters says yes with 72% to the EEA agreement, and only 12% would say no. Although that's also the center party is quite critical. We also see a division among the red party. Sorry, the SV, that's the Socialist Party, not the Center Party. So red voters are also divided, with 40% of red voters saying yes and 39% saying no. But again, the agreement still is the sort of association to the EU that has the most support. I found a more recent poll from November 23, where so here you have the EU barometer, and the question that was raised was if there was a referendum on EU membership now, would you vote yes or no? And here what we see is still a high level of no, with 51.8, so a slightly higher number than in the poll in April, and 31.3% of yes vote. But what's interesting for me is the sort of evolution of the two votes. What we see is a bit of a broken decrease of the no's since the mid-2010s, and a slight increase, but a more jagged increase of the yes. So what we basically see is a fragile but unstable progression of the yes vote. Now, if we look at the EEA barometer, we see that by far this is the one that has the most support, because the question that was raised, if there was a referendum on the EEA agreement today, would you have voted yes or no? And here we see that the EEA agreement is by far the least controversial of the two issues. But obviously, what these two polls show is that there is still not enough of public or political support for EU referendum on EU membership here. Now I'd like to say, how long am I doing time-wise?
You should have 4 discussions.
Okay. Then very quickly on the agreement, because this is the most important one. And here the conundrum is basically Norway is not a rule maker, but is a rule taker. Because a lot of the legislation that is decided in Brussels has to be, at least in the areas that are covered by the EEA agreement, has to be applied and implemented into Norwegian legislation. And here that's the main conundrum. So here on the first quote from the Economist, Norway's peculiar relationship with the European Union, it abides by most EU rules, but has little say in writing them. And here we have other things, integration without representation. Obviously through the EEA, Norway is integrated into the legislative framework of the EU, but has no say in what it has to actually implement. So it's influence from the outside. So again, the EEA agreement links Norway to the EU's internal market, and is basically the foundation of Norway's European policy. It also sets the condition under which Norway, as a non-EU member state, can participate in EU policy making. It's a de facto associate membership status, but again, Norway is not represented in EU institution, but it's almost as integrated into the EU as many EU states are. So decisions that are taken in Brussels have a direct effect impacting Norway and Norwegian act. Also strengthen Nordic cooperation, because Sweden and Denmark and Finland are EU member states, and that's also one way through which the Norwegian colony can also have an indirect say into EU policy making. The EEA covers a number of important things. The fourth freedom is one, so the free movement of goods, services, capital, and persons. So Norway is also part of Schengen, so you don't need to show your passport when you go to Norway. It's just like going to France or Italy. It also covers most of the important horizontal policies, so environment, social policy, consumer protection. some common rules related to state aid and cooperation, competition, obviously cooperation, so Norway participates in EU programs, so we have a few, we get funding from Germond actions, or Rise 2020 or Rise in Europe and the like, EU agency, also Norway is represented in not all, but some EU agencies as well, and also plays a role in cohesion policies through the EA and the Norway grants. The EA does not cover a number of very important policy areas, such as sub-country issues, the common trade policies. Norway has its own trade policy, it also has its own custom policy, which means that if you order something to a website in France and have it delivered in Norway, you will have to pay import fees. Something which, by the way, I learned at my own expense, and they're not very cheap. Norway, the EA does not cover the common agricultural and fisheries policy, regional policy isn't covered. EMU, obviously Norway still has the Norwegian krone, which is not very good, because I was saying the Norwegian krone is rather weak. So it's a very good moment for you to come to Norway, because you get more Norwegian krone for the euro, but it's disadvantageous for me. Justice and home affairs are not covered, and the common foreign security and defense policy is not covered. We have celebrated the 30 years of the EA, and since I'm running behind time, I will just, this is a nice summary of what the EU does, and also does not, but we can just read it in the slides. One of the very important debates about the EA is the democratic implication, largely because it's, Norway is then a rule taker. And it has to apply legislation, at least all the legislation that is covered under the EE agreement, but really has no say on this legislation. So that has been a very controversial political issue, and obviously it's a still ongoing debate and very much a democratic problem that Norwegian citizens, through their elected representative in the Norwegian parliament, for instance, have no influence over laws and regulations that come from the EU and also have to be applied in Norway. So just to basically conclude, and that was the result of a study conducted by a number of Norwegian colleagues in Oslo, that we can consider that the EA has a surplus in benefit, but a deficit in co-determination. It has been a relatively remarkably adaptable agreement, but then one of the questions, because obviously the EU we're looking at in the mid-2020s is very much different again from the EU that saw the birth of the EEA in the mid-1990s. So is this the institutional setup of the agreement still adapted to today's EU? Because obviously not only are we facing a number of very crucial challenges, but also the depth and the breadth of European integration has considerably enlarged. The EA was very much a pragmatic compromise and to some extent a balancing act, but that also become more difficult again as European integration gets broader and deeper, and obviously especially in the current situation it becomes very difficult to kind of separate geopolitics and foreign policy from internal market issues, which was a lot easier to do back in the 1990s, where some people somewhat optimistically predicted the end of history. I thank you very much for your attention, and I would now open for questions. So just very briefly, if you are interested in learning a little bit more, then these are some suggestions for further reading.
Many thanks, Carine, for a fascinating lecture. Two main, things have to be mentioned. History, very important. You cannot explain why Norway stays out of the European Union without history. Second thing, continuity, what you said, very strongly demonstrated by your lecture and very much detailed. I think we now have the opportunity to discuss with you this phenomenon, this historical phenomenon. Also the very interesting methodological approach of comparative referendums analysis. So 72 and 94, very, very similar. So just the same outcome of the votes, so very interesting. So first of all, we would like to have a first round of questions. Lucas Hermann is the first. Second one is, who's next? Come on. Is Mrs. Nowakowski. And the third question will be by Mr. Wagner. Okay, start with Lucas Hermann.
Okay, my first question actually regards a topic you briefly brought up, and that is Nordic cooperation. And I wanted to ask you, where do you see the future of Nordic cooperation in Norway's security policy? Considering that Norway has been a consistent NATO member state since 1949, a Nordic cooperation in the security policy field has really been more of a complementary issue, not a central one. But since both Sweden and Finland have now also joined NATO, a lot may have changed in this regard, especially considering that all three countries share a border with Russia.
First question directly to the future, the NATO related. Mrs. Nowakowski, please.
You mentioned that during the referendums, the Oslo area is pretty much open for joining the EU. Is there a difference when it comes to gender or age? So are like younger people more open for Norway joining the EU?
So it's a generational issue, and then Mr. Wagner.
And how come Norway was willing to intensify its relation with the other Nordic states, while the other Nordic states were the one invading and governing Norway, and not the mainland European countries?
Sorry, your question is?
And so how come that Norway was looking to intensify its relation with other Nordic states, and not with the mainland Europe?
Yeah, okay.
Why?
Right, so maybe I answer your two questions first, because they are not related, but they touch upon this complex of Nordic cooperation. So your question, sorry, it's the end of the day, so it was about NATO and the future.
It was mostly about Nordic cooperation and Norway's security policy.
Well, I think now it's not so much Nordic security cooperation, but it's mostly towards also how Norway can also contribute to EU, TFDP, and there are, for instance, Norwegian battle groups who are sent for peacekeeping operations outside the EU or inside the EU, but I think especially now in the current the Nordic cooperation is fine, also in military and security policy area, but I think there is a need for also strengthening EU military and defense policy, and I think Norway certainly has a role to play. There was before, I think there is a before and an after in the 2014, and especially the invasion of Ukraine. I think definitely before NATO was the military alliance as the one that Norway would be looking to for defense. Nordic cooperation was the icing on the cake, but not the cake in itself. I think now, especially in the new geopolitical environment, there is probably a stronger willingness of Norway to contribute to, at least to a much larger extent, not to the extent of member states, obviously, but to strengthen military and security cooperation. And that's not necessarily sending troops, but it can be, cyber security, because obviously Norway is a very highly digitalized country, so hence cyber attacks, if you have one from Russian hackers, then basically it's the country which is completely lahmgelegt. So this sort of preparation, I think, is playing an ever more important role. It's hybrid warfare, And I think here Norway also has a lot to contribute as well. Your question, sorry, refresh my memory, it's the end of the day.
Asking why Norway was willing to intensify its relation with other Nordic states. And
Oh, because despite the history. Well, I mean, yes, they have a history which is not necessarily always happy, but at the same time, you have a lot of, because of this shared history, there also are a lot of similarities, cultural, language. And if you speak one or understand one of the Scandinavian language, basically you have one, you understand three. So if you do speak Norwegian and understand Norwegian, you can also read and understand Swedish and Danish and vice versa. So it works good. Finnish is a slightly different issue, but you have a lot of similarity. Obviously, Finland was also under Swedish dominion, so you have a sort of relatively homogeneous bloc. That way, all four countries, you have a relatively higher level of trust vis-à-vis public and political institutions. They also have this historical tradition of cooperating together. So you have a lot of similarities that makes the Scandinavian country a relatively homogeneous country, and therefore it's often easier then for cooperating among themselves, while cultural, political difference would be much more important with other continental European countries. You do see it; they're all in the north, and obviously cooperating with Italy, Spain, Portugal, or even France would demand much different cultural understanding. So I think that also explains why, despite all this history, which is not as bloody perhaps as, obviously you had some wars, but I think that makes cooperation among the Nordic countries a bit easier as well, because of the linguistic, cultural, historical proximity that exists. Your question was about the referendums and the generational, but also the gender gap. There were a lot of women that were against membership, largely because Norway, I think I mentioned that earlier this morning, Norway was at the vanguard of gender equality policy at the time. Still in the 1990s, we didn't have the gender equality policy or gender mainstreaming that we have now in the EU. I think probably gender would not be such a contentious issue if we had a third referendum, but it was definitely, there was a really strong concern that membership of the EU would sort of dilute this strong gender equality policy that was quite important for Norway. The generational, I'm less familiar. I know there is a very, if you're interested, there is an extensive study from the Norwegian Statistical Bureau that looks into very much into not just the spatial distribution of the yes and the no vote, but also the sort of demographics of the yes and the no voters, both in terms of age, in terms of education, in terms of gender as well, in terms of so it looks at a number of socio-economic and demographic factors, and it's very extensive. I don't have all the numbers in mind, but if you are interested, I'm happy to give you a bit more details on that, at least show you where you can find. But it's a very extensive study. To my knowledge, I don't think it exists for the 1994 referendum. In 1972, there was this extensive statistical issue, which is really great for if you are interested in writing a bachelor thesis on that. I had one of my students who wrote a bachelor thesis on women or women's organization and the no vote. It's unfortunately in Norwegian, so unless you want to brush up your Norwegian, which is always a good thing.
I have another question when it comes to the rising popularity of declaring, yes, we want to join the EU. when during our EU Parliament elections a few weeks ago, especially the parties that were quite against the EU as it is right now are on the rise. How do you feel about that? Is there like a discussion about this, or is this like not included at all?
Okay, and further questions, if you have. Leonhard, please, yes.
Darf ich auch auf Deutsch?
Ja.
Okay, ja.
Kurz auf Deutsch.
Ja, auf Deutsch. Sie haben Norwegen beschrieben als einen Sonderfall in Europa und es gibt noch einen zweiten Sonderfall, das ist die Schweiz. Und wenn man so schaut, die sozialen Institutionen, also die kommen einem vor wie ein soziales Museum. Der Neoliberalismus in der EU hat einiges weggefressen. Nun schaut man sich mal an, die Schweiz und Norwegen sind Staaten, die haben Patriotismus, die haben funktionierende Armee, da fährt die Bahn. ja, gut, okay.
Zur Frage.
Ja, wie können sich diese Staaten diese Sonderrolle leisten? Und wenn ich genau hingucke, dann sehe ich bei Norwegen dieses große Potenzial aus den Öleinnahmen. Ja. Und bei der Schweiz das große Potenzial als Fluchtort für Milliardäre. Also die Schweiz haben ein gewaltiges finanzielles Potenzial. Jetzt ist die Frage, wäre diese Sonderrolle Norwegens auch denkbar gewesen ohne diese Sondermittel, ohne diese reichhaltige Versorgung mit zusätzlichen Einnahmen?
Gut.
Ja, das war's.
Danke. Einmal noch, habe ich noch eine Frage übersehen? Herr Biel vielleicht zuerst noch, bitte.
Okay, in a lot of European states we can see a rise of populist, not formally, especially right-wing populist parties. Is there something similar in Norway?
Okay, und jetzt Herr Herrmann noch.
Yeah, I wonder how strong is the prevalence of European identity among the population in Norway, considering that a rejection of the EU membership doesn't necessarily equate with a rejection of European identity.
And this is the point which I jump on. You mentioned this strong disliking of unions. That's very interesting. So is this related also with a big distrust vis-à-vis hegemony or empires? I think to be not a member of a union means something. So is this related with a kind of rejection of hegemony? Is the European Union perceived by Norwegians more or less perceived as a hegemonic project related with bureaucracy? You know, no empire without bureaucracy. You need big bureaucracy for having a strong empire. So this is also related to the identity issue and the specific Norwegian way of disliking unions.
Yes, I suppose that there is this. Maybe I'll start with the question backwards. For a chance to start with you and then make my way down towards the end of the room. I think there is definitely that. I think part of the, if I go back to the sort of arguments that were used against membership, we see, perhaps I wouldn't frame it in terms of hegemony. I think that's perhaps less of a concern, but definitely this democratic aspect was very prominent, because the Norwegians have a very well-functioning democracy, and they are a staunch supporter of democracy. And I think there was always this perception that perhaps because of this sense that you have a heavy, complex bureaucracy in Europe, that this would take away some of the democratic legitimacy from that's not very far from the democratic deficit debate on the EU, and I'm not always supportive of that debate, but I think democracy is a much more important concern than seeing the EU as a hegemony power. Maybe it's the same sort of concern that is framed slightly differently, but I think democracy played a much more prominent role, which is to some extent also ironic, because the main criticism towards the EEA is that basically its lack of democratic legitimacy, because then again you have to adopt legislation without actually having any say on this sort of legislation. So there is it's a little bit of an ambiguous or ambivalent relationship towards democracy.
Populism, right-wing populism.
Yes, that's definitely something that is exploited. But I think at the same time there is this consensus that the EA is to some extent the best of both worlds. It's not ideal, but it works and has worked so far relatively well, or at least as best as possible. Sorry, refresh my memory. What was your question?
My question?
There was identity, related to identity.
Yes.
And this sort of conundrum between national identity and European identity. I think it's probably different. There's a difference depending on who you ask in Norway. I mean, in the larger cities, I'm pretty sure that, especially among the younger generation, I mean, the Norwegians are relatively wealthy, they travel abroad for holidays, the Norwegian students, they often go at least for a semester for a study abroad, they study foreign languages, they are very fluent in English, so I would say probably this generation, I mean my generation onward, and your generation certainly probably would have no real problem in identifying as European, not necessarily as EU members, but as European in the broader sense. I think if you go in a less populated area of Norway, I think that this national identity would be much stronger. And again, the one or the other is not necessarily completely, one does not exclude the other. I feel French, but I still also feel European. So this is like a layer cake way. But I think again, it's the younger generations probably would feel more European. Why the older, and perhaps that's a bit schematic, I also understand that would have this much stronger national identity. Your question, yes. I mean, Norway is ein sozialistisches Land. For better or worse, mostly for better, but sometimes also for worse. But it wouldn't, es hätte es sich nicht leisten können ohne das ist ja ganz klar. Und das war auch einer der Gründe, weshalb sie auch nicht in der EU wollten, weil die wollten ja auch das Reichtum beibehalten. Ja, und ich meine, das haben sie auch gut gemacht. Das wird auch meine Pensionierung bezahlen, wenigstens das hoffe ich, wenn ich da endlich mal pensioniert werden kann. Das ist ja erst
bis 72 Jahre.
Ja, genau. Aber klar, ich meine, das Geld, und ich meine, die Norweger, die haben das ganz clever gemacht, damals in den 60er, 70er Jahren, weil die Amerikaner und die Briten, die wollten auch schon mal ein Stück vom Pie haben, aber die waren sehr, sehr clever, das haben sie sehr gut gemacht, aber das im Gegensatz zu anderen Ländern, die da, so wie Russland zum Beispiel, das haben sie gut gespart, gut verwaltet, und jetzt ist, wie gesagt, einer der reichsten Sovereign Fund aber das gibt natürlich auch eine gewisse Macht. Wenigstens nicht Macht, wenigstens Choice, Wahl, Option, genau. Und das erklärt, also abgesehen davon, ob Energie ein contentious issue war, aber dann, da können sie sich das auch leisten, außerhalb der EU zu sein. Das ist ganz klar. So lange Rede, kurzer Sinn, ja, Geld hilft ja immer.
Everything is answered.
Ich hatte nur die...
Please.
Can you just quickly...
The rise after the...
oh yeah, the rising populism.
Yes.
We see the same thing in Norway. I think this is perhaps not quite as acute as we might see or hear in Germany or France or Italy, but there are also a number of far-right populist party who are also exploiting fears about immigration and migrants. Obviously Norway has also received its share of migrants from Syria, Ukraine, other countries in the world, and migrants in war or poverty. And I think I remember reading somewhere that by the end of the century, the Norwegian ethnic population would be outnumbered by foreigners in the wide sense of foreigners like me, which are probably fitting it slightly easier. And obviously that is a concern that might be exploited very easily by sort of far-right or populist party.
But so far it doesn't damage the uprise of people voluntarily saying we want to vote yes in the next referendum. You showed us the chart that the votes for yes are still like rising, but like the parliament, like the right-wing parties criticize the EU like heavily, and they are on the rise, but it doesn't so far show in that, right?
Well, I mean, obviously the context has also changed, and for Norway is where do you see the security of the country better catered for? Obviously, being outside or inside the EU doesn't really play all that much. I mean, sometimes it also Norway also received a share of the COVID vaccines as part of the EU plans for distributing. I think that was through Denmark and through Sweden. I think we got some of the COVID vaccine. So again, because Norway has this very close association, sometimes it doesn't really change all that much whether it's a member or actually not many. It plays a role for a number of things. But yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I actually answered your question.
You did, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time. I have to thank very much Deborah Kuchia, who prepared and organized the stay of Carine. I have also to thank our camera team for video making for our website. Many thanks. And also thanks for coming, for discussing, for listening, and last but not least, many thanks to Kathleen for giving us a wonderful lecture. Many thanks.